This is not just a story of a blind and deaf girl. This is the story of a heart that refused to give up. There are some stories that touch the heart deeply. Stories that teach us that no matter how dark life becomes, we can find the light within ourselves. Today, I want to tell you the story of a girl who could not see, could not hear, and could not speak. Yet she rose higher than most people ever dream of. Her name was Helen Keller. Helen was born in a small town in Alabama, America, on June 27, 1880. In the beginning, she was just like any other child, full of life, full of laughter. Her parents, Arthur and Kate Keller, loved her dearly. But life took a cruel turn when Helen was only 19 months old. A high fever attacked her tiny body. Doctors tried their best, but the fever left her completely deaf and blind. Imagine a little girl who had seen the colors of the world for only a few months, now trapped in a silent, dark world. No sounds, no sights, no way to understand the people around her. Helen's world became full of confusion and frustration. She would throw tantrums, hit people, break things, because she had no way to express her needs, her feelings, or her fears. She lived in darkness, both inside and outside. Her parents watched helplessly, heartbroken, desperate to find a way to reach their daughter. But destiny had other plans for Helen. When Helen was 6 years old, a woman named Anne Sullivan entered her life. Anne herself had faced great struggles. She had been almost blind for most of her early life and had fought hard to get an education. She understood the world of darkness better than anyone else. When Anne came to Helen's house as her teacher, she brought with her not just lessons, but hope, love, and patience. The beginning was not easy. Helen, wild and uncontrollable, did not trust anyone. She was used to getting her way by screaming and hitting. But Anne was firm. She knew that kindness alone would not teach Helen. She combined love with discipline. She believed Helen was intelligent and capable, even though the world saw her as a hopeless case. Anne started by teaching Helen a simple idea, that everything has a name. She used her fingers to spell words into Helen's hand. For example, when giving her a doll, she spelled D-O-L-L into Helen's small hand. At first, Helen did not understand. She thought it was just a game. But Anne did not give up. She repeated again and again every object's name by spelling it into Helen's hand. The breakthrough came one day at the water pump. Anne placed Helen's hand under the running water and spelled W-A-T-E-R. Suddenly, something clicked inside Helen's mind. She realized that the cool thing flowing over her hand had a name: water. This was the moment when Helen's entire life changed. It was like a window opened in her dark world. She became hungry to learn more. She wanted to know the names of everything. Her hands moved eagerly, touching, feeling, learning. She learned hundreds of words quickly, and soon after, she learned how to write. Helen's journey from that day forward was a journey of miracles. She wanted to do everything normal children did. She wanted to go to school, to read books, to express her thoughts. But in her time, there were almost no schools for children like her. Once again, Helen's determination and Anne's belief worked together. Anne taught Helen not only fingerspelling, but also how to read Braille, a special language of raised dots that blind people can read by touch. Helen mastered it. Later, she even learned to speak. Yes, speak. Though it was very difficult for someone who had never heard sounds before, Helen practiced tirelessly by feeling the vibrations of people's throats and trying to copy them. Her speech was not perfect, but it was clear enough that those who loved her could understand her. Helen's dream was to attend college, and she did. In 1900, she entered Radcliffe College, a part of Harvard University, which was a remarkable achievement for any woman at that time, let alone a deaf and blind woman. Anne Sullivan was by her side, spelling every lecture into her hand, helping her read every textbook, guiding her through every challenge. Helen graduated with honors, becoming the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. Her story became known around the world. People were amazed by her courage, her intelligence, her spirit. But Helen was not satisfied with just her own success. She wanted to help others. She wrote books. She gave speeches. She traveled around the world to inspire millions of people. She spoke about education, about women's rights, about helping those with disabilities. She showed the world that disability is not inability. She showed that the only real disability is a lack of hope. Helen lived her life with a heart full of gratitude and service. She could have stayed angry at life for what it took away from her, but instead, she chose to be thankful for what she had and to use it for good. She became friends with famous people like Mark Twain and Alexander Graham Bell. She received awards, honors, and respect from governments, universities, and organizations across the globe. Yet, she always remained humble, always reminding people that the true victory was not hers alone. It was also Anne's victory, the teacher who had believed in a wild, angry little girl when no one else did. Anne Sullivan remained Helen's companion, interpreter, and best friend for almost 50 years until her death. After Anne passed away, Helen was deeply heartbroken, but she continued her work with even more passion, honoring the woman who had given her the world. Helen traveled to over 39 countries, inspiring leaders, students, and ordinary people. She helped raise millions of dollars to support schools and programs for the blind and the deaf. She spent her life making the world a better, kinder place. Helen Keller's story teaches us many lessons. It teaches us that no matter how great the challenges are, the human spirit is greater. It teaches us that education is a light that can break any darkness. It teaches us that love, patience, and belief can change lives. Helen herself said, "The only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision." She believed that real blindness was not about the eyes but about the heart and mind. She believed that each of us, no matter our struggles, has a mission, a light, a gift to share with the world. Sometimes in life, we all feel lost. We feel that our problems are too big. We feel that no one understands us. But when we listen to Helen Keller's story, we realize that if she could overcome the walls of darkness and silence, then surely we can overcome our small fears and doubts. we realize that strength is not about physical ability. It is about the courage to keep moving forward, even when the path is invisible. Helen Keller passed away peacefully on June 1, 1968, at the age of 87. She left behind a world that was brighter because she had lived in it. Even today, her books, her speeches, and her life continue to inspire millions. She showed us that life is not about what we lose, but about what we create with what we have. Helen Keller's life is not just a story of one woman. It is a story of the human soul, a story that belongs to all of us. It reminds us that even in the darkest night, we can find stars. Even in the hardest moments, we can find strength. Even when the world seems silent, we can still speak through our actions, our love, and our courage. So whenever you feel like giving up, remember Helen Keller. Remember the little girl who could neither see nor hear, yet taught the world how to live. Remember that your limitations are not your destiny. Remember that within you too there is a power greater than you know. A light waiting to shine, a voice waiting to be heard, a dream waiting to come true. You are capable. You are strong. You are unstoppable. Anne Sullivan, the woman the world knows today as Helen Keller's teacher, is almost a divine figure for special educators. Her arrival gave a directionless life to a blind and deaf child, a direction the entire world witnessed. If we could become even a tiny bit like Anne Sullivan, this world would be a different place, wouldn't it? While Anne Sullivan is mainly known as the constant companion and the guiding force behind Helen Keller's success, did you know how brilliant, talented, and determined she was? Let me share some fascinating stories from Anne's life that you might not have heard before. The first story is that Anne wasn't even supposed to get the job as Helen Keller's tutor. Yes, Captain Arthur Keller, Helen's father, was very hesitant and unsure about Anne initially. He was understandably reluctant to entrust his 6-year-old blind and deaf daughter's future to a frail 20-year-old girl. After all, due to Helen's disabilities, no one had been able to teach her basic manners like eating, drinking, sitting, or standing properly. Captain Arthur was looking for a strong, experienced, and mature tutor whom Helen would take seriously. Anne, on the other hand, was completely inexperienced. Moreover, Anne herself was partially blind. To top it off, she had no formal degrees, diplomas, documents, or certificates in special education. So, when Captain Arthur Keller interviewed Anne, his first words were, "You are barely older than my daughter." Anne replied, "That's true." The captain then said, "And you yourself are partially blind." Anne agreed, "That is also true." Then Captain Keller asked, "So why should I entrust her to you?" And then, with a unique spark in her eyes, Anne replied, "Because only I know what it feels like to be trapped in darkness. I will fight to free Helen from this darkness, just as I fought to free myself." A silence fell over the grand living room of the Keller family. Captain Keller was speechless. He simply nodded in agreement. The courage with which Anne dared to ask the captain for a chance, her compassion, and her unwavering determination had won his heart. Thank goodness. That day, she convinced Captain Arthur that she would give her 100% effort to reach Helen's inner world, and history bears witness that she gave her all. She transformed Helen Keller from just another unknown child with disabilities into a name etched forever in the pages of history. Now, let's move on to the second story. What kind of student would a girl as stubborn, determined, and fiercely resolute as Anne have been in her time? Absolutely right. So, it happened that in 1880, when Anne Sullivan enrolled in the Perkins School for the Blind, it very quickly became everyone's opinion that 14-year-old Anne was a rebellious, defiant teenager who wouldn't listen to anyone. Anne came from a very traumatic background. An alcoholic father, a mentally unstable mother, and then an abusive government-run orphanage. And now, at the Perkins School, people started saying that Anne was short-tempered and ill-natured. One day, after such an incident when fingers were being pointed at her from all sides and the whole corridor echoed with voices saying that Anne was an impossible case, completely wild, Anne shouted loudly, "What do any of you know about hunger? What does it feel like when rats crawl over your body while you sleep?" Anne's outburst caused a pin-drop silence in the corridor. But then a lady teacher stepped forward and wrote in sign language on Anne's palm, "Pain can shape diamonds." This was Laura Bridgman, an alumna of the same special school and now a teacher there. She was the world's first deaf, blind, and mute person to learn and master the English language. And that was the turning point in the story of the stubborn and rebellious Anne. When Laura wrote those words on her palm, Anne fell silent then. But from the very next day, she started picking up books and attending classes. Her head was still held high with pride, but the fire in her heart burned even brighter. With Laura Bridgman's guidance, our Anne Sullivan gradually began her positive transformation, and later, her very defiance, her refusal to give up, became her greatest strength when she herself became a teacher and entered Helen Keller's life. Now, let's move on to the next part of Anne Sullivan's life, my friends. Now, let's move to the third story. And this is the story of the word that broke through the darkness of Helen's life. Yes, absolutely. Every Helen Keller fan and every special educator has seen the movie The Miracle Worker, whether it was the Disney version released in 2000 or the older 1962 one. And even if you haven't seen the whole movie, you must have seen that viral scene on the internet where Anne Sullivan drags a stubborn, wild child, Helen, to the garden, forcefully places Helen's hand under the water pump, turns it on, and then spells out WATER on her palm using touch spelling. Helen is completely frustrated. She has learned the WATER symbol, but so what? What nonsense is this? What does her teacher Anne want? And then suddenly she felt the cold, flowing, tangible stream of water, and just like that, Helen froze. She pulled her teacher Anne's dress, gesturing to feel it again. What was that? Anne turned on the pump again. Helen put her hand under it again, and then she touched Anne's hand, asking her to spell it out. Anne quickly spelled WATER on her palm, sometimes touching Helen's hand to her own lips to make her feel the vibration of how water is pronounced. And then the color seemed to drain from Helen's face. Her palm trembled. The first word of her life had just been born. Seeing this, her stubborn, determined teacher, Anne Sullivan, fell to her knees on the grass, not out of exhaustion, but because she had just witnessed a miracle as a result of her hard work. The scene from the movie I just described is a huge eureka moment. Every time you watch it, tears well up in your eyes. But very few people know that water wasn't Helen's first word. For many weeks before that magical moment, Anne had been consistently spelling words like doll, cake, and mug on Helen's palm, cheek, and arm. And Helen was learning these spellings. The only thing was that Helen hadn't made the connection that everything has a name, or that every person has a name. So, basically, that miraculous moment at the water pump was a breakthrough, a tipping point. But before understanding that the name of this wet, cold, flowing thing was water, Helen Keller's special educator had already gone through a very long and frustrating journey, where everyone around her thought Anne's efforts were useless and futile. But it was only Anne's persistence and her unwavering belief in the step-by-step and usually lengthy process of reaching the inner world of a child with special needs and teaching them that finally brought success to both teacher and student at that water pump. And now, let's move on to the fourth story about Anne's talent, her genius, her brilliance. What do you think a deaf-blind child can learn, my friends? Just imagine the challenging task for a tutor who has to teach a child who can neither see nor hear. As we are often taught in special needs teacher training, the higher the special needs, the more you should teach practical skills to the child so that they can do their daily tasks independently and keep themselves safe. For example, you would teach a child with high challenges buttoning and unbuttoning clothes, brushing, personal hygiene, toilet independence, police, ambulance, and their parents' phone numbers, and their special school's name and address, etc., etc. And it fully makes sense, right? But do you know what else Anne taught Helen besides the etiquette of sitting, standing, eating, drinking, personal safety, English language, and other subjects? Anne taught Helen literature from a very young age, even the complete works of Shakespeare. Imagine how intuitive a storyteller she was, how innovative Anne was. Think about it. She would first fingerspell every single word of Shakespeare's plays onto Helen's palm, and then Anne and Helen would both act out the emotions of those plays together, not for a stage performance, not to show anyone. A true teacher doesn't apply ideas and techniques to show off. They just do everything for the well-being of their student. These two would act out Shakespeare's plays at home using body movements and gestures in Helen's room. So, what special educators today are taught about giving multi-sensory input to children and providing tactile exploration of concepts, Anne was already doing all of that at that time without learning it from anyone. That's why Helen could understand rhythm, imagery, drama, poetry, and emotion so deeply. And that's why, when she grew up, she became such a great speaker that her speeches gave people a sense of powerful advocacy for social justice, disability rights, and women's suffrage. Although Helen's speech or diction was often not very clear because of her disabilities, the passion with which she used non-verbal elements like body language, intonation, and pitch to convey her message captivated audiences. Doesn't hearing such an extraordinary success story make you feel that everything is possible if you are determined to do it? We salute such an inventive and miraculous teacher. The fifth untold story about Anne Sullivan that we bring to you is about her eyesight. Basically, when Anne was 5 years old, she contracted trachoma. Trachoma, friends, is a type of infection in which the eyelashes can turn inward, and if this infection recurs, it can lead to blindness. And that's what happened to Anne Sullivan. When she was just 5, trachoma caused severe vision loss, and despite repeated treatments, when every cure failed, at the age of 14, Anne arrived at the Perkins School for the Blind in Alabama. Then, Anne underwent several surgeries, and she regained some of her sight. That's when we heard how, when she applied for Helen's tutor vacancy, she was partially blind. But did you know, friends, that when Anne was in her 30s, she became almost blind again? So it happened that Anne often suffered from unbearable pain in her eyes throughout her life. It was truly excruciating, and her eyes also became sensitive to light. Helen often found Anne sitting in a dark corner of her room in the evening, covering her eyes with a cloth. When Helen would tiptoe into the room and gently remove the cloth from Anne's eyes, asking if her teacher was feeling worse again, Anne would say, "No, I'm just a little tired. That's why I'm sitting like this." In reality, Anne wasn't just tired, she was scared. That familiar stinging, that swelling, that feeling of a million needles pricking her eyes terrified Anne at the thought that the vision she had regained with so much difficulty might now slowly disappear forever. Sometimes, in such a state, she would rest, not giving in to the darkness, because darkness was a very old companion of hers. She would rest so that the very next day, she could once again get up and teach Helen words like moonlight and light. Anne often continued to teach and educate Helen in such physical discomfort because this pain had become a part of her life, and she had dedicated her life to helping a child whose disability was far more severe and profound than her own limitations. Friends. But now I'm confused about which story to tell you first, as the one that follows naturally in this flow talks about how strong Anne's dedication was towards Helen and the great sacrifices she made for her. However, that story is a little, or rather, a lot, sad and heavy. So, let's do one thing. For the sixth story, let's hear a rewarding and positive one. Imagine it's 1932. In a large hall of a great university, Anne and Helen slowly walk towards the podium. Anne has her hand on Helen's shoulder, guiding her way. The entire hall echoes with thunderous applause, but the loudest applause is Helen's. And why shouldn't it be? Today, for the first time in their lives, these applauses are for Anne Sullivan. Just then, the Vice-Chancellor of Temple University in Philadelphia announces, "Today, we are, for the first time in the history of our university, bestowing this award upon a woman, honoring her with an honorary degree, and not for any invention or powerful leadership, but for her futuristic vision, for such foresight that pulls mute souls out of their silence." Anne accepts the honorary degree with trembling hands. She isn't trembling from nervousness. She is trembling from the validation that has now arrived. Anne felt as if all those whispers she had spoken into Helen's ears for decades, sometimes teaching, sometimes shedding unseen tears, had all been gathered up and handed to her today in the form of a rolled-up paper scroll. So basically, friends, this was in itself an unprecedented, groundbreaking moment. Firstly, because Anne was a woman. In those times, it was rare for a woman to receive an honorary degree. Secondly, she was a teacher, not a scientist or a leader, and at that time it was very rare for a teacher to be publicly awarded like this. And thirdly, she was a special needs educator. Never before had a university taken the initiative to bestow an honorary degree upon a special educator in this way. You remember just a while ago, we learned that Anne Sullivan didn't have a formal degree in special education, right? So when she finally received a formal degree, it came in abundance, making up for all the past. And why shouldn't it have? After all, this award was the result of 10 to 12 years of patience and tireless hard work done invisibly while living in obscurity. She wasn't sitting around thinking, where do I see myself 5 years from now? She wasn't working with such aims or a vision board, at least not for herself. Yes, she certainly had goals and dreams for Helen, and a dedication to making every dream of Helen's take flight. Dedication. That's the word that would probably come up in every story of Anne Sullivan's life that we've told you today. And this very word brings us to the most painful story of Anne's life, today's last story. It's a bit heavy, but since I've promised you, I have to tell it. So, let's fast forward 17 years from that miraculous moment of a deaf-blind child learning her first English word. 17 years have passed since that miraculous moment of a deaf-blind child learning her first English word. Now Helen has grown up and is graduating from Radcliffe, the most rigorous and difficult women's college in America. Of course, Anne is by her side 24/7, fingerspelling every word of every subject's lectures onto her palm, reading heavy books to Helen in the same way, and helping her with homework and research work. And you remember that Anne's own eye health wasn't particularly good. In the midst of all this, Helen gets the opportunity to write her autobiography. And Helen doesn't want to let go of this opportunity because, after all, both women need money to live. Anne, as a teacher and guide, wants to refuse this proposal, thinking that if they start writing a book, how will they study? But on the advice of some close family members, a young English lecturer from Harvard University, the very handsome John Macy, comes to help Helen and Anne with the editing of the book. And John is the first person who sees Anne as an individual separate from Helen. He believes that Helen certainly has a fighting spirit, which has helped her achieve such extraordinary success in life. But in John's eyes, the greatest genius is Anne Sullivan, who was only 20 years old when she started working her magic in the life of a blind and deaf child. John is very, very impressed with Anne. He falls in love with her and wants to marry her. Although Anne's heart has also begun to desire John, she is unable to decide. She tells John that he should move on. She believes that John doesn't understand yet, but the way Anne is completely tied to Helen 24/7, there might never be any space for love or a husband in her life. When Helen learns about this, she explains to her teacher that Helen's happiness lies in Anne's happiness. Anne clearly asks John if he understands that Helen will always be her first priority. Even after their marriage, Helen will always live in the same house with both of them. John says that he accepts all of this. Finally, the day arrives when Anne and John are getting married. But Anne's heart is pounding not like a bride's, but like the warning of danger. On the wedding day, even after all the guests have arrived outside, Anne is hidden in the kitchen, pretending to work, hoping to somehow delay this moment. She feels like something terrible is about to happen. But everyone convinces her, and Anne and John's wedding ceremonies are completed happily. However, from the very first day, whether it's going on a 10-day honeymoon trip or fulfilling her duties towards her husband after marriage, Anne always finds herself divided between these two loved ones. It's not that John had agreed before and was now realizing the reality. No, in fact, he himself would read books by brilliant minds like Karl Marx and Eugene V. Debs to Helen, exactly like Anne, using finger spelling. He also took responsibility for Helen and wanted her well-being. But even before the marriage, John believed that Anne Sullivan, who carried Helen on her heart and mind like a 24-hour responsibility, was not letting Helen become independent. Why wasn't Anne letting her be free? Let Helen make her own mistakes and learn her own lessons. How long would she keep protecting her? What was she even protecting her from? And after the marriage, John just felt neglected. John's love was genuine. For the first few years, John was understanding, yet Anne didn't have any children, so that her love for Helen wouldn't diminish. On top of that, all three of them worked constantly just to make ends meet. John in his editing job, and Helen and Anne by sharing their stories of struggle and breakthroughs with the world through articles, books, and speeches to earn money. Then, a few years later, when Anne herself was trying her best to save her relationship with John, it was probably too late biologically for them to have children. Ultimately, the duties of a teacher and that rare bond, like two bodies and one soul, between her and Helen, overpowered Anne and John's love, their relationship, their marriage. John grew tired of the struggle. He gave up on always being the second priority to his wife, his beloved. And then one day, John left their lives saying that he had tried his best, but sorry, he couldn't live up to what was expected of him. Friends, don't misunderstand John. He loved only Anne in his life, and Anne loved John very much too. Perhaps she wasn't wrong either. Only she knew how she was not just Helen's teacher, but also her liberator. She was like Helen's second self, her permanent warrior. Anne fought countless battles for Helen, with her in her defense. Many of these stories are known to the world, and many more probably only Anne's heart knew. John and Anne never formally divorced. Perhaps their love, their soul connection, was above all that. Later in life, John's financial struggles not only ended, but he also became a very successful author. Anne always told him that he was an excellent literary critic. And on the other side, Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller dedicated the rest of their lives to advocating for better services for deaf-blind people. They wrote books on such topics, gave speeches to raise awareness, and raised funds to empower persons with disabilities. Well, this last story has made things so heavy that I don't even know how to conclude or on what note to sign off. So I'll just say that this was our small tribute